Welcome, everyone. This is the Aristotle and Purpose session this afternoon. My name is Daniel Maher. I'll be the chair and the commentator. We've arranged to use the following format. First, May will present her paper. I have a short response, and then we'll open it for questions to everyone present. And we ask that you will establish a queue using the chat function. And so we'll end then at about 35 minutes after the hour or 40 minutes after the hour, and that will leave about equal time for our second speaker. So I'll just begin by introducing May, and she'll handle her paper, Professor May Sim from College of the Holy Cross.
Thank you, Dan. And
if I may, one more thing, I have to tell everyone we're being recorded. You need to know that this is being recorded, and if you have a problem with that, turn off your video or say goodbye to us. Thank you.
Thank you. So my paper topic is Moving Naturally and Knowledge for Aristotle and the Daoists. So here's an outline. Aristotle and Daoists, such as Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, will be compared in this paper when it comes to how things move, the difference between natural and artificial motion, and how each is known. I will then trace these accounts to their respective first principles, that being the unmoved mover for Aristotle and the Tao for the Daoists. I'll proceed to a brief consideration of their ethics and resources for dealing with environmental problems. Now, all of these authors agree that things that are by nature move themselves. And things by nature for Aristotle are exemplified by animals, parts of animals, plants, and so forth. Anything that has in itself a principle of motion and rest. In contrast, artificial things such as beds and plates have no innate impulse to change. In contrast, when it comes to the Taoists, the natural things consist in the 10,000 things, everything in the cosmic world. And essentially, these are the things that have in themselves the power or the potentiality to move themselves, to express their natures. And for Aristotle, the four candidates for nature are things such as the underlying matter, the hyperkamene, hule, that is essentially something that persists through all change. And then another candidate is that of shape that could be formulated in a definition, and it can also be the shape or the form that is the identifiable cause of something, such as man being the cause of man. And then the final end is also the shape into which something grows. So Taoists don't separate form and matter. They don't prioritize form or actuality or definition or naming. Rather, what is natural or ziran is epitomized by unhewn wood for Lao Tzu, whereas Aristotle focuses on the shape or form that makes something actual and defines its nature. For Lao Tzu, it is the uncarved wood with its potential to become an infinite number of things that makes it natural. And why is that? It's because the Tao, or the way, has created heaven and earth and set everything in motion. As the DDJ states in 37, it does nothing, and yet nothing is left undone. Unhewn wood reflects the infinite possibilities of how nature moves, just like the Tao. So instead of separating opposites, it states, know the male, but preserve the female, and be a Kenyan for all the world. If you are a Kenyan for all the world, constant virtue will never leave you, and you can return home to be a child. It continues then to rival Aristotle's separation of form and matter as opposites, prioritizing form as definition, because a child cannot distinguish between opposites nor make distinctions and separate things. A child then is closer to the natural state of infinite possibilities, whereas Aristotle emphasizes definitions. For Lao Tzu, definitions actually limit things, our perspectives, and our relations to the world. He states the 5 colors blind our eyes, the 5 notes deafen our ears, etc. By excluding everything else that isn't name, one closes off the rest of the world and isn't capable of acting virtuously toward it, contradicting the movement of the Tao. Now, Zhuangzi would agree with Lao Tzu, for right and wrong are constantly in a process of alternation. So by asserting that something is right rather than wrong, one fails to understand the process of transformation by the Tao, which is invisible, without definite form, yet capable of moving and stopping. So celebrating the indefiniteness of the Tao, Daoists don't pursue knowledge of the natures of particular things as if they were fixed. So Daoists, as we've seen, accommodate the constant motion and change of natural things by eschewing fixity and universality of knowledge and definitions. Rather, knowledge is about the present context and what is right action or inaction. Aristotle, in contrast, focuses on the universal or unchanging in knowledge of how things move by examining the causes or the reasons why natural things come to be, go out of existence, and change. As I've said earlier, then, for Aristotle, knowledge then would consist in knowledge of the 4 causes, such as the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause. Now, Daoists will stress the practical knowledge of particular things that are constantly changing, whereas Aristotle would emphasize theoretical knowledge of universals that are unchanging. Certain types of things always move and change in the same ways. Daoists focus on the potential transformations of a thing, always aware of the particular context. For example, whether the fish is going to be eaten by a bear. In contrast, Aristotle attends to the actual form of the fish, producing other fish, or the form that is the final end into which a fish grows. The possibility that fish may become bear food is knowledge of the present moment. Whereas for Aristotle, that's not a matter of knowledge. Rather, it's an accidental particularity that is only accessible by perception. In contrast, Daoists don't subscribe to the sharp separations between universals and particulars or knowledge and perception. For Aristotle, because form is the substance of a thing that is definable and determines the generation and growth of a particular thing, such motions are knowable. Now, in opposition to the linear motion of natural things toward their respective goals in Aristotle, Daoists maintain the unpredictability of how natural things move. For example, fish that doesn't produce other fish. If there's a general characteristic of how natural things move for Taoism, it is that of turning back or returning to the root. It states, the myriad creatures are all in motion. I watch as they turn back. Each returns home to its root, and returning to one's root is called stillness. This root of stillness is destiny and constancy, and someone who knows constancy has understanding, literally clarity. It continues by stating that one with knowledge of constancy then would be able to act in an accommodating manner, working for the common good. And this work is heavenly, and what is heavenly is the Tao. So knowing how things move is also to know how the Tao moves, which is to be the source of the 10,000 things, nourishing them, and not having any particular desires. When all things return to the root of stillness of the Tao, they also return to the state, quote, before there were things, called the formless form. So Aristotle then holds that each natural thing moves toward a definite form and individuality. In contrast, Daoists hold that things move toward formlessness and nothingness. For Aristotle, knowing form is to know how something moves toward its specific end and remains one and the same. For Daoists, knowing how everything moves is to know its oneness with the Tao. Names and definitions don't reveal how things move, because if all things are moving toward nothing, names and definitions are no longer relevant. Now, moving from natural to artificial things and their motions, Aristotle holds that artificial things don't have their ends or goals in themselves and cannot move by themselves. But like natural things, it is the form that determines an artificial thing's motion toward its final end. Unlike them, artificial things such as houses and health rely on builders and doctors to shape the matters into forms. For Zhuangzi, instead of a craftsman's imposing a form on some generic matter, such that form is separate from and prior to matter, there is a coincidence of form and matter. The task then of the craftsman is to look for how matter is already shaped into the intended object. So, for instance, he talks about Cookding's carving the ox by following heaven's principles or patterns, Tianli, where his knife moves through the gaps around the bones of the ox, avoiding the bones and nodes in the flesh. Or craftsman Qing, who fasted for 7 days to still his heart-mind, after which he had no thought of reward nor condemnation that might accompany this project. He had even forgotten that he has a body. Then he entered the forest, looked at heaven's nature. Then he sees the completed bell stand. Then he added his hand or his craft. So far from Qing's imposing a definite form on a generic type of matter to support a bell, the wood already contains the completed bell stand. Perceiving the particular way this tree has grown, Qing's craft united with heaven's way and resulted in a product that looked like it was crafted by a spirit, the sort of carving that cuts nothing off. So whereas Aristotle sharply separates the ways that natural and artificial objects move, for Zhuangzi, the natural and artificial are related intimately, so that artificial objects actually grow out of nature. Qing doesn't need to cut anything off from nature. Rather, production is completely effortless, Wu Wei, because he's going with the flow of heaven's Tao, letting the natural growth of the tree guide his art. Now, Aristotle insists that form causes matter to move. Without the final end or the form of the artificial thing, matter just would not have been moved in certain steps. The final end of the tree and the bell stand are entirely different. So Aristotle would characterize the tree's growth as an accident or a freak of nature. And the reason is because he doesn't subscribe to Zhuangzi's fluid boundaries between natural and artificial things, how the natural could have its end outside of itself, or the artificial could have its end internal to itself so that it is already complete. Now, I'll move to trace their different accounts of natural and artificial motions and knowledge to their respective first principles. And we've seen that for the Daoists, the Tao is the source of the 10,000 things. It's indefinite, formless, and it's the law of the natural, or Ziran, nourishing everything indiscriminately and is free from desires. Each thing then isn't discrete from another. All things aren't rank ordered as better or worse. All are one because they come from and return to the same Tao. In contrast, for Aristotle, the first principle is God, or the unmoved mover, who is the most stable and definable because he is immovable, prior in cause, time, and separability. And as the most knowable principle, he sets the standard for all knowledge. So comparing them, God then is most definable. In contrast, the Tao is not definable. God is transcendent, whereas the Tao is both transcendent and immanent. As pros and cons, things are rank ordered hierarchically according to their closeness to the standards set by God, such as stability and definability and priority and time, cause, and separability. Whereas for Taoists, all things are one and equal because they come from the same Tao. So here are some implications for ethics and the environment. The indeterminateness of the Tao and transformations of things mean that there's no fixed distinction between what is good and bad. Virtue doesn't consist in the pursuit of knowledge of absolute truths or the practice of specific virtues, but that doesn't mean that there's no knowledge of virtue. For instance, Zhuangzi talks about the Tai clan person. He says sometimes he regards himself as a horse. Sometimes he regards himself as an ox. So not contradicting or criticizing others, showing that his knowledge is not of something fixed, is exemplary of his knowledge. Or the Taoist sage who uses various rights and wrongs to harmonize with others and yet remains at rest in the middle of heaven, the potter's wheel. So as you can see here, the movement, right, is one from know to is to know and so forth. Now, Aristotle's God, as we've seen, is determinate, self-sufficient, unchanging, independent, and is the norm for the highest human good of contemplative wisdom. And this, in turn, is contrasted with phronesis, or practical wisdom. Phronesis is what issues in generous and just actions. However, phronesis isn't consistent with God's independence, since generous and just actions depend on others who are in need, and God is independent. God can't be exercising practically wise actions. So God's determinateness for Aristotle leads to sharp boundaries between theory, practice, and production, as well as the contrast between natural and artificial things. Whereas the Tao's indefiniteness leads to a view where there are no sharp boundaries between theory, practice, or craft. Whereas Aristotle holds that contemplation is prior to and higher than phronesis, the Tao equalizes all things. Whereas Aristotle contrasts theory with practice so that phronesis is only effective in the human realm. Virtue for the Taoists is doing what's right for the moment, and that includes the 10,000 things. The harmony then includes humans and non-humans without any preconceptions favoring one's own desires or that of one's species. So let's turn to their environmental resources. I want to say that the Taoists offer more resources for addressing environmental problems from privileging human desires. So instead of a first principle that is separate and transcends this world, Tao's immanence in everything moves them toward the same formlessness as itself. And as a result, the Taoists can offer us a non-anthropocentric perspective and standard from which we could, as Lao Tzu puts it, support the 10,000 things in their natural conditions. Thank you.
Thank you, May. Yeah, there's some clapping hands there. Very nice. Let me begin the response just by saying I'd like to raise a series of questions really intended to invite May to spell out more fully some of the elements of the paper. First, the paper presents the Taoists and Aristotle as parallel and opposed, primarily with respect to natural motion, art, and what I will call, for shorthand, their first principles, God for Aristotle, the Tao for Zhuangzi, and the others. Aristotle sees natures as determinate and knowable, but for the Taoists, Lao Tzu in particular, this is a quotation, unhewn wood is the epitome of nature or what's natural, because it's open to becoming an infinite number of things. So Aristotle sees natural beings as ordered to a telos, although chance could interfere. The Taoists, by contrast, see each thing as unpredictably or even equally open to all future possibilities, insofar as unhewn wood is free from desire to become any particular thing. Whereas Aristotle emphasizes the internal constitution of a being with respect to its telos, the Taoists focus on potential transformations due to its surrounding environment. I take it as obvious that Aristotle knows some fish become food for bears rather than reach their natural fulfillment, and I take it for granted the Taoists know that fish often reach maturity and spawn baby fish. So Aristotle emphasizes that natural end, the Taoists emphasize the indefinite possibilities. So do you find these two accounts compatible but differing in focus, or are they incompatible? If incompatible, do you find them equally plausible? I don't know how to answer that, but when I think of them as opposed, I would identify the core of the disagreement by quoting Heidegger. Heidegger, in Being and Time, says, higher than actuality stands possibility. Taoists would endorse this thesis, Aristotle would deny it. Nevertheless, when Aristotle argues for the priority of actuality to potentiality in Metaphysics 9, he nevertheless grants a certain tribute to potentiality. Even if we concede that the chicken is prior to the egg in substance, time, and definition, we are forced in the process to recognize that matter is permanent, or constancy, to use the Taoist word. Form is episodic. If every egg and every chicken presupposes an eternally anterior actual chicken, by the same logic, it presupposes an eternally anterior potentiality for that actuality. As a result, there is an important sense in which, even for Aristotle, all determinate things are, quote, turning back to the root. In every actual natural substance, the potentiality of matter to be otherwise always asserts itself over form. What can be otherwise perishes, turning into its opposite in the matter that survives, either immediately or over time. Aristotle emphasizes the other side of the coin, but both sides are inescapable. And Aristotle recognizes that nature means both origin and the telos. So my second question, how close is Aristotle's acknowledgement of matter to what the Taoists say? Third, and here I quote May, she writes, I've alluded to how these Taoist perspective is based on the Tao's being the source of the 10,000 things, and its characteristics of being indefinite, formless, modeling on the natural, so that it nourishes everything indiscriminately and is free from desires. That's the end of the quotation. As things are stated in that text, the conception of ordinary things is based on the Tao, as if the Taoists conceived the Tao first and appraised particular beings in that light. By contrast, as Aristotle is presented in the paper, he reasons to the characteristics of God on the basis of what he observes in sensible substance. In order to account for generation and corruption that he sees, Aristotle says we must postulate, ultimately, God is unmoved mover. Is this contrast accurate? Does the Zhuangzi, or do the Taoists generally, reason from the Tao to what is the proper way to understand things, whereas Aristotle reasons from things to the way to understand God? Does their conception of the Tao inflect their observation of things, or is it the case that the Taoists conceive the Tao on the basis of direct experience with what Aristotle would call sensible substance, but they simply interpret what they see differently? Next, I'm hoping you can say more about this, I'm going to quote again your phrase, the sort of carving that cuts nothing off. In the story of King and the Bell Stand, it's not clear to me whether he did or didn't cut anything off. The quoted passage says he added his craft, or he added his hand, his craft that accords with heaven, combined with heaven's nature. And that sounds to me like he actually cut the wood in ways that respected its natural constitution. And here I quote the paper again, King's craft united with heaven's way and resulted in a product that looked like it was crafted by a spirit. So if there is actual cutting, does the person who wishes to carve in this way need to choose the right matter? Do you have to pick the right sort of wood for each sort of carving? Or does Wangzi conceive that that same piece of wood was equally open to being a bell stand, a baseball bat, bookshelves? If I've misunderstood and there is no actual cutting, is it simply our attitude toward the wood that turns it into a bell stand? And with these remarks, I'm led back to my first question, the distinction between potency and potency for a determinate end and the indefinite possibilities afforded by matter. As I read the paper, the word I kept expecting to see but did not was violence. Whatever similarities between art and nature for Aristotle, the root of the distinction between them is that nature operates from within and art begins from without. Art is violent. Violent motion is, he would say, posterior to natural motion. So my final question is whether the Taoists deny that distinction, as Bacon did, who called it a supremely idle move. Does the Tao make all motion equally natural? And those are the end of my comments. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dan. Those are, wonderful comments, and I think that I'll just start then by offering, some brief answers so that there'll be time for the others. I think that you're absolutely right in saying that Aristotle also has an account of potentiality, and it's just that he doesn't emphasize the potential as much as the Taoists, and they actually take opposing views when it comes to their emphasis. But the point of my paper is to talk about these motions, natural and artificial, but also how they are knowable. And you'll notice that whereas the potential motion for the Taoists, such as Zhuangzi and Laozi, is actually something that relies on one's knowledge to be able to identify, for instance, that wood that has already grown into the shape of a bell stand. That takes a certain sort of knowledge that Aristotle would deny is knowledge, but rather those are accidents. If you really knew about that tree, for instance, that it's an oak tree, then what your knowledge of the oak is that it is going to, produce acorns and more oaks and so forth. And he would not be talking about one's ability to know that particular bell stand that has grown out of that tree. And as to your question about whether they are compatible or incompatible, I think that what is happening here is that their emphasis are so radically different. And I'm putting that difference in their emphasis on their first principles being that different, the very determinate, unmoved mover for Aristotle, and the totally indefinable Tao for the Taoists. So despite the fact that they're talking about natural motions and artificial motions, they're very different accounts, especially when it comes to artificial motions, in my view, is what makes them so radically different and incompatible in terms of their first principles, but comparable. So I don't want to say that they're incommensurable so that we can't compare them, because I have actually compared them. And as for the question about the Taoists moving from Tao to the things and Aristotle from things to the first principles, I actually don't subscribe to that description of what's happening in these two camps of thinkers, but rather my understanding, and once again, it's my view that one's metaphysics actually, right, determines everything else. So here, I think that it is Aristotle's view of the unmoved mover that leads him then to identify the other things in the world and how they are more or less substantial, depending on whether they satisfy his conditions for substancehood. And likewise, for the Taoists, they start with the Tao, the characteristics of the Tao, and then move on to explain everything else. Now, as for your question, when it comes to Qing, whether he actually cut anything off, the thing is that it was minimal. It was as if he didn't cut anything off at all, because he didn't violate the complete structure of the bell stand that was already in the tree. And likewise, for somebody who knows how to carve an ox or a turkey during Thanksgiving, the greatest carver is one who could, carve the whole bird and then put it together so that it doesn't look as if it has been carved at all. And that goes to your question about violence and violence in art. And that then will answer, the way by which the Taoists carve would answer that question about violence, because they are actually not doing violence to the matter, and that they're actually looking to kind of coordinate their actions and help everything else in nature. They are not violating nature when they are engaging in their craftsmanship. Whereas for Aristotle, a craftsman would always go and approach, right, the matter already with a preconception of, oh, I want to shape this into, say, a bow, right, or a violin, and would do a lot of damage in that sense. All right, that's all I have. Thank you very much.
I want to ask a question. Put your name in the chat. So far, there's just one. Please go ahead.
I just wondered about what if we approach Aristotle from the other end, from that of prime matter. Okay, now prime matter is totally indeterminate, all right? It is form potentially. So it is pure potentiality. And then it seems to me we can kind of resort the way the comparison works, because he really needs that doctrine of prime matter, without which there would be no individuality, no thousand things. So I just thought maybe if we tilt it in that direction, it would lead to a way of kind of conceiving the contrasts in another way. Somehow the necessities of metaphysics itself is going to drive you. So that's my whole.
All right. Thanks, Alvin.
Yeah.
And much as I would like to move with you in that direction, I think that for Aristotle, prime matter is completely unknowable, right? It's not anything at all without the form. So we're still stuck with his prioritization of form, and his not acknowledging or giving a lot of weight to the particularities, which for him can only be accidents, which can't be known, but perceived. He allows the perception, but it's not knowledge.
But that's why I said the necessities of metaphysics force him to bring it into the system. So, you know, again, it's sort of, this is, I suppose, metaphysics in a way. You can't exactly say it's unknowable because it follows from the logic of his position to an attempt to encounter things. So the identification of knowledge with form has this underside that, that it can't reach. You could put it that way because that's sort of epistemological necessity. But that which comes first in being is last in knowing, and I'd like to leave it. And with that, I will absent myself.
Thank you.
Well, it's about 36, 37. We're about halfway point here, so perhaps we should thank May for her paper, and we should move on to our second speaker, Edward Halper, the Distinguished Research Professor and the Josiah Meigs Distinguished Teaching Professor at the University of Georgia. I invite you to take the mic, please.
Okay, no, thank you. So, let's see if I can change the view here. Okay, so I realized when I read over this paper, which I hadn't done recently, but I realized I left out a little introductory paragraph just to give Dan a hard time. The introduction would have said something like, this is an exploration of a problem, and I don't have a particular solution to the problem. I spend the whole paper formulating and reformulating the problem. And I hope that I'll hear from Dan or some of you whether it's really a problem or not. So yeah, here goes. I start with a contrast between the ancient classical perspective on nature and the modern perspective, modern being 17th century, which we're still live with today. The ancient perspective is that nature and life are identical. Nature is an internal principle of motion, and the things that have internal principles of motion are most properly are living things, like things with souls. So soul and nature go hand in hand. They're just two perspectives on the same thing. Whereas for our modern period and for our contemporary way of thinking of things, nature and life are distinct. Nature is inert, and life somehow is somehow very different. It's got purposes and decisions and actions and productions and ethics and all sorts of things that you just don't find in nature. And the question that I want to ask here is how, from the modern perspective, does life come about from nature? So I'm concerned with the idea of evolution, which provides some sort of an account of this. And it seems to me it doesn't. Well, I want to explore the account that it offers, and I want to just think about the problem and how to understand the problem as a problem. So back to the classical perspective, where nature and life are identical. The ancients talk about soul. That's the way we usually translate it. It's not a very good word for my purposes. Of course, it's got a lot of religious baggage that I don't want to deal with. What's interesting about it is that souls have a substantial character. They're things, and there are two bases for this. One of them is knowledge. There's just an idea of like knows like, and if we can grasp things in the world, substantial things in the world, then our nature must have some sort of substantiality to it. This is the kind of argument you get in Plato, you get in Phaedo, and in Aristotle, and it's often associated with the eternity of the soul. But I don't think that's the primary function it has, even in classical philosophy. It has more to do with the substantial nature of the soul. And the second basis for the substantiality of the soul is this idea of the the substance, the nature, having a plurality of parts, and all of these parts are somehow united. What is it that unites them? It can't be another part, because then you're just going to raise the next question. Well, what unites that other part with all the other parts? You need something of an entirely different sort, and that something of an entirely different sort is called a form or a soul, and it's identified with the function. So these various parts form a unity when they can all function together. And this unity is it's a substance. I've just given you the central books of Aristotle's Metaphysics in 30 seconds. So I hope it's a little bit intelligible. But anyway, when we set aside this classical perspective and go to the modern perspective, now we're dealing with matter, and matter is inert, at least assumed to be so. And the question is, how does it acquire these characteristics? So I can formulate the problem is, where do we get souls or purposes or life? Is it something that has a substantial character in itself, or is it somehow a state of matter that comes to the matter? And if it's the latter, then where does it come from? How can it come to the matter? And it's not a problem that's ignored, but it's not really discussed very much. Spinoza in particular talks about there's a sort of a fundamental character of matter. It has a conatus. It tends to preserve itself, and this is really important for the way that his philosophy develops. But the problem is that there isn't any reason why matter should have that character. It just does. And it's a little bit mysterious how it can have such a character. What is it that makes matter strive to preserve itself? Okay, well, let's think about this again, same question from the classical perspective. A substance is something where the parts all function together. And the nature of the thing is whatever it is that those parts are doing together. And there are different kinds of things. There are different, plants and animals and human beings, and plants are engaged in characteristic functions. Animals are engaged in characteristic functions. All of the parts are working together, but there's one sort of guiding function. And the thing about all of these cases is that the function is its own end. The thing functions in order to preserve itself. And what this means is actually pretty concrete. Animals can sense, and they need to sustain themselves as beings that sense. Well, having senses allows them to sense opportunities for food. They find the food, they eat it or ingest it in some way, and that sustains them so that they can continue. The function of the animal is its own end. The animals engage in a kind of self-sustaining activity. What it is to do what it does to preserve itself doing what it does. It sounds, it sounds sort of simple, and in a way, it's kind of obvious. The nature of the animal is just to be what it is, and the end, the purpose of it, is to sustain itself. And we can talk about the sustaining of the species, and we'd get into the unmoved mover that May was talking about before, but we don't have to do that. It's enough to know that the animal somehow sustains itself. I want to move a little bit to the modern perspective and ask the same question here. Why is it that animals somehow sustain themselves? How do we approach this question from the perspective of modern philosophy or from contemporary philosophy? And the answer that immediately comes to mind is it's evolution, of course. What else could it be? Things sustain themselves by adapting to their environment so that they'll be able to preserve themselves. And this changes them, and it results in a gradual change of one species into another species. You know the story. It's all very familiar. And my concern is how to understand this adaptation in terms of matter. What I'm trying to come to grips with is how it is that matter acquires a function, and how it is that matter comes to preserve itself. And this is sort of the central argument here. If it's the case that we have to appeal to evolution, we're engaged in a circular argument. And the circular argument is, I've got to presume that the animal is striving to preserve itself, and that it causes the animal to adapt to its surroundings. I've got to assume that in order to explain why the animal adapts to its surroundings. The problem with appealing to evolution to explain the origin of life is I've got to assume some sort of purpose in evolution in order to explain the development of purposes. Now, of course, evolutionists deny this. I mean, they'll say, no, we're not talking about purpose at all here. We're just talking about, but you have to start from an animal to begin with in order to have an evolution. And the question is, where does the life come from? Where does the animal come from? How is it that the animal, the initial animal or any animal, arises from something that's material and therefore inert? And I think that this is it's a disturbing argument, because it seems, when you read the accounts of evolution, they seem very plausible. There's very good evidence there's some sort of evolution. It's just when you think through the metaphysics that's involved, that it seems to me we run up into the kinds of problems that are bothering me here. And by metaphysics, I mean exactly what I'm talking about here. What kind of a thing is a function? So I'll give you sort of a couple of examples that I mentioned in the paper in passing. So maybe it's the case that that a purpose it comes about from matter in the way in which a chemical equilibrium comes about. And it seems to me it's a good example. So what's a chemical equilibrium? You put a couple of reagents, couple of chemicals together, and there's a reaction in one direction, and then there's another reaction in another direction, and eventually they come to an equilibrium. The impulse for one reaction is exactly balanced by the impulse for the opposite reaction. And if something is introduced, some more chemicals are introduced into the system, it readjusts and you get a new equilibrium that's established. So it looks like there's something like purpose in the chemical equilibrium. And maybe somebody might want to say that, well, that's the origin of life and the origin of purposes. Okay. The problem is, even though there are similarities, there are also really crucial differences. The equilibrium there's only a function if it's disturbed. It reestablishes something if you push it in one direction. It isn't like a purpose. It isn't like a function, because the functioning of the animal, right, is what sustains the animal and makes the animal be what it is. That's the nature of the animal, at least on the classical perspective. On the modern, on this, what I'm calling the modern perspective here, the equilibrium looks like it's a good candidate, but the equilibrium also doesn't reproduce itself. So it doesn't sustain itself in this really fundamental way that life sustains itself. The equilibrium is set up. I mean, sometimes it can come about naturally, but it's set up usually by us. And it doesn't, it's not really a good example. So let's try another one. I take a deck of cards and I throw it up, and it lands all they're all you know, I get a bunch of cards. Now the idea is if I throw it up enough times, eventually, at some point, I'll get all of the suits of cards arranged in order, right, from smallest to the highest, and everything will be perfect. And you know, enough chance throws, and it'll come up eventually, right? So the idea is, you know, evolution has this opportunity to repeat the process again and again and again, and we're going to get something that sticks, and it will hang together. So that's great. I mean, that sounds wonderful. It sounds particularly completely plausible until you ask the question, but wait a minute, that's just a structure. Where does the functioning come in? It would be different if the cards, you know, I throw the cards up and then eventually they not only land in order, but then they start throwing themselves up and falling down again. It's the as evolution is usually explained, always explained as far as I know, what you get is a structure that comes eventually by a bunch of chance interactions. Now, I mean, there are problems with that. There's scientific problems with that. I'm not concerned about them. I'm concerned with the metaphysical problem. That what has to be produced by this chance is something that seeks to sustain itself. That's the purpose, that's the function that I'm talking about. And this is what I'm having trouble understanding how it could come about. So, all right, so the equilibrium isn't a good candidate. The deck of cards isn't a good candidate. There's a philosopher that I talk a lot about in the paper, Daniel Dennett, who is basically, you know, everything comes about through evolution. And what was interesting about Dennett to me is he's aware of the problem of function. And he says that a function is just another structure. And what you really need is, you know, a bunch of chance interactions, and then one of the structural changes will be also a functional change. And that's how we can understand how a thing sustains itself. And that sounds, it actually sounds better when he says it than I do, but it's actually sounds pretty plausible until you start wrestling with it and ask, well, you know, how do you get, if you have a crystal, for example, a crystal has a beautiful structure, everything is orderly and regular, and the crystal maintains itself in that structure. If you push one of the nuclei out of place, it will come back into place. It's you know, it functions here, but it doesn't. How do you get a function out of a structure? And even if you want to say that the function is itself part of the structure, just a bit of something here, we still need some way to connect that bit of function with all the rest of the functioning that makes the organism into an organism. So it seems to me that it's not a very solvable problem. Dennett talks about the parallel between the genetic structure and what he calls memes, the bits of information. And this is another kind of paradigmatic analogy that people have talked about to resolve the this problem. Just as, thinking about internet memes, somebody has a bit of information and it gets transformed. It's transformed and passed along, and just like that, one little bit of genetic information is passed from thing to thing. Okay, it still seems to me that this analogy doesn't solve the problem, because information, a collection of memes, it's still a structure. And what we don't have is the functional aspect of it. And this is what I'm really concerned with here. How is it that a structure gives rise to function? And it's the functional character that is fundamental to life. So I don't think we can really explain this unless we really resort to something else. So yeah, Dennett also talks about, you've got a bunch of functions and you need to organize the functions, and that requires some sort of a second order functional character, a second order functioning, an executive function, he calls it. And Dennett's analogy here is, well, it's really no more difficult than your cell phone. You've got an operating system on your cell phone, you've got a bunch of apps, and your operating system keeps track of your apps. And so too, biological organism, it's got a operating system that keeps track of the apps and makes sure that everything is functioning smoothly. So again, it's an analogy that seems powerful and plausible until you start thinking about it. And you think, well, yeah, but my cell phone it's not out for itself. It's not trying to sustain. It's a tool that somebody has to use. And the thing about an organism, life, is that it's its own end. And it's that sense of purposiveness, of being an end, having an end, of striving to preserve oneself, that I think is so difficult to explain as emerging from matter. And anyway, if Dennett were right here, we could have a bunch of functions, and then we have another function, and then we have some other function that we get an infinite regress of functions here that's responsible for somehow using all the functions. And what we don't get is the rich connection that we as human beings have with each other, and sharing our thoughts, knowledge, problems, and functioning together as human beings. That's what's really mysterious. So if you're looking for a resolution, I'm sorry I disappointed you, but I hope it's a problem that's worth thinking some more about. So thank you.
Let me begin with some comments here. So I have three pairs of terms I'd like to focus on. They're more clear in the paper than they were in what we just heard, but they all fit, and I think they're all worth pursuing. So the first pair is survival and life. The second pair is purpose and end. And the third pair is really just the word matter understood in two different ways. I'm completely in sympathy with the goals of the paper and interested in all these topics. And so I really just want to highlight some things that are worth discussing. And the first one is really matter, and this question of matter as inert as opposed to matter conceived as potentiality in Aristotle's sense. And Aristotle is sometimes mocked for his occasional endorsement of spontaneous generation. His problem there is it's not as bad as it is for the moderns, because some life forms are so simple it doesn't take that much working up of the matter before they might become actualized. But he's got the potency in it, and I wonder if most of these people like Dennett, the book that is discussed in the paper is called From Bacteria to Bach, but the book actually begins before bacteria with inert matter. And it seems to me that that's a much greater problem for people like Dennett. And I just wonder, isn't it an insuperable problem? If we conceive matter as inert, don't we inevitably reduce living things to less than they are? Doesn't it become impossible? So that's my first question. And I'd like to turn it to purpose and end, these terms for addressing these issues. The paper emphasizes the term purpose in living beings precisely in order to bring attention to this peculiar phenomena of life. The paper begins with the explanandum rather than the imaginative conception of the beginning of things. And I think that's the right place to begin. I wonder if purpose is the best term. And so I'd like to see more about that. Halper writes, structure alone never makes a function. The example in the paper is a table, which is said not to be properly purposive itself. The structure reflects the purposiveness of its maker or its user, he writes. And I think there's an important difference there between the maker and the user. I bring this out, I would distinguish terminologically between end and purpose. An end is the fulfillment of a thing, whether it's natural or artificial, but a purpose, I would use that term only for a rational agent, or especially for a rational agent. The telos or end of the axe is chopping, but the axe itself has no purpose. People using the axe have purposes, whether that involves chopping or hanging the axe on display. The maker of an artifact assigns the end into the matter by structuring it as an axe. And this enables us to distinguish between the function of the artifact and the countless purposes to which a human being could turn it. A pen is for writing, even though the pen has no designs on saying anything, and even though it may also be used for various purposes, a bookmark, a weapon, a form of advertising. These other purposes are differently related to the pen than writing is. To return to the language of the paper, I'm not sure we should say living things have the purpose of surviving, especially when the human case of using the table has been brought forward to deny that the structure of the table embeds a purpose. The person who uses the table as a table differs from the person who uses it for firewood. Each is possible, but one use destroys the end embedded in the structure by the maker. So however we settle the language, I would point out again that some contemporary biologists are much more opposed to the language of goals, ends, and purposes than is acknowledged here. Some are so hostile to anything approaching teleological activity that they interpret survival as nothing more than an effect. Mice do not run from cats in order to survive, they say. The mice that run from cats are the only mice we have left. On this view, all organisms obey simple necessity, and the results are what has to be. I mentioned this to underline how important it is to establish the distinctive phenomena of life that is the focus both of the paper and what we just heard. This brings me to the third pair of terms, survival and life. In part for the reasons just stated, when we identify the end or purpose of the living being, I wonder if life is better than survival. Each organism has a distinctive form of life. Darwin or Darwinism cuts it down to survival, a name that's indifferent to the distinctive manner of life for each kind. I think Nietzsche's formulation might be excessive, but the spirit of his criticism, that survival is a low goal, I think is on target. In Beyond Good and Evil, he says, a living thing seeks above all to discharge its strength. Nevertheless, there is something absolutely essential about survival, and this helps to bring out what it means to be alive at all. I want to quote from Hans Jonas. He speaks of the paradoxical fact that living substance, by a primordial act of separation, detached itself from the overall integration of things within the totality of nature. It positioned itself vis-a-vis the world and thus introduced the opposition between being and non-being into the indifferent assuredness of existence. So that's the thing that is hard to explain. How exactly does life come to be and separate itself from its environment? Matter on its own endures effortlessly in existence. If survival was the point, nothing would ever become alive. Being or non-being is an alternative that arises only for living beings. In Jonas's word again, life is mortal, not although, but because it is life. And this, I think, is the important core at the heart of the term survival. My point here, or my question, is whether the word survival is sufficiently fresh in biological discussion to bring attention to what is genuinely strange in the phenomenon of life. Survival of the fittest has become a slogan that covers the phenomena more than it reveals them. And I wonder if it is necessary to say more to bring out the distinctive character of life, both in the species-specific sense and in the sense that is common to all living beings. My suspicion is that doing so might help us contrast static structures with the dynamic flow of organisms, and to show how different things are when the blind automatism of chemical processes gets raised up into metabolism. As I said at the beginning, I endorse the argument of the paper. My concern is only for it to be as strong as possible. Although there are some contemporary biologists who do not run with the pack, much of contemporary biology is blind to life, and there's urgent need for this type of engagement. Thank you.
Wow, thanks a lot. Those are great questions. I don't know how adequately I can deal with them, but I appreciate having them to think about further. First of all, the first question about whether matter is the question about matter being inert, whether it's an insuperable problem. I don't know. I think it's if it turns out to be, then maybe there's something wrong with the whole modern perspective on philosophy. And I'm not. I wouldn't be surprised if we needed to really rethink a lot of things that are really fundamental. But I'll just mention that one of the things I do say in the paper is that Hegel is concerned about this, and he tries to. He starts with matter as an inert thing, and he argues that when we think of matter in this way, we're inevitably going to think of it in relation to other bits of matter. And we've got to ask the next question, how do they interact with each other? And that very thought leads to gravity, and all of a sudden matter is no longer inert. Now, what I find really interesting about it is that the thought of matter as an inert thing is not really something that's stable. It leads us on to another idea, and we get a kind of evolution that eventually develops into human life and the rest of all those things that you were talking about, Dan. But this is an evolution, but it's an evolution that's conceptual. And that's why I distinguish it from Darwin. Darwin and the biologists set aside that conceptualism. They're looking for real biological evolution. Hegel doesn't make a distinction, but really there is one. Anyway, my point is, I don't know that it's not solvable somehow. I just don't have the solution for it, and I think it's really worth thinking about it. And it may be that it's not solvable in the terms in which it's posed, and in the terms in which we're thinking about biology, and more important, thinking about nature. So the second one, and actually your third and second problem seem to me to have a kind of similarity to them. That there's a difference between purposes. And life, you want to say, and you want to identify purposes with human activity, and that's pretty plausible. The reason I resisted it, and also the reason that I talked about survival, is to make the notion of a final cause, an end, something that's not mysterious, but really concrete and exists in physical things. The distinction between life and purpose is often a distinction between non-humans and human beings. And we do something that's really different from animal life. Our purposes are far more extensive, and it does seem to be a little bit trivial to talk about our ends as being survival. So we should talk about them as being flourishing, living a kind of life where we exercise our faculties and have art, and knowledge, and all of and political communities, all the things that we do as human beings, and that's much a much better way of understanding it. And I purposely avoided making the distinction because I really wanted to focus not at the high end of the development, but the beginning of it. How does it get off the ground in the first place? And that's I appreciate your comment about Jonas about this. Yeah, somehow matter separates itself and is, and it's more of an observation than an account. It just, yeah, it must have happened somehow, but how is it possible to happen? And I think it's that possibility of this that I'm really trying to focus on here. Once you introduce matter as something that's fundamentally inert in itself and maybe comes into relations with other things and develops these various relational characteristics, okay, once you do that, you have to account for the origin of life. And it's not something that you have to account for in ancient philosophy, because life is substantial. Once you see life as a character of matter, it's very mysterious how it could be. And that's the kind of thing that I'm really focusing on here in the paper. So I collapsed a lot of things that I might have not have collapsed if I were giving a fuller, richer account.
Should we give a moment to a question here from Robert Innes?
Yeah, sorry. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
You've almost already answered my question, or at least gestured to it, and deals with the very notion of sustaining itself in the case of humans. I've spent the last 7 years working with cultural psychologists at the Niels Bohr Center at University of Aalborg in Denmark, and their whole issue is to start at the top and work down, not start at the bottom and work up in terms of what it means to be sustained as a specific type of being. So it's clear that we do need to settle the whole issue of emergence, but it's not so much the emergence of, well, you have the emergence of order, then you have the emergence of living things, and then the emergence of psychic structures, and then you have the type of emergence that has become conscious of its own emergence, and that's the kind of semiotic emergence. And I find that in the case of what we're trying to talk about here, and you talked about flourishing, and you in a certain sense answered these questions near the end, what is really the phenomenological scope of the very notion of sustaining itself in the case of humans? And it has to be connected to semiosis, to the continuity of the development of forms of order until we have self-reflective beings or self-referring beings who refer to themselves in widespreadly different cultural forms. And it seems to me that it's not so much here a matter of pure metaphysics, but also of cultural psychology, of the psychic, of the forms of the psyche that emerges in these different traditions. So Nietzsche's view of sustaining itself is very different from the Daoist notion of sustaining itself. So my question is, it's not so much a question I think you could answer in a one-word snap sentence, but it's a matter of broadening the phenomenology that would be needed at the top to see how far then that phenomenology can go down, as opposed to seeing how did we ever get up to the top by starting low. So do we start low or do we start high? And almost everything that I've heard today in the other talks always are, how did we get here? But the question is, where are we? And let's go down to find out what those roots are, and then who is this we? I don't know what you could say to this in sort of the 35 seconds that we have left for this meeting before people head to the water fountain or to something stronger.
Yeah, well, I may have induced a heading for something stronger after this. But anyways, thanks for the question. I can't look. Sure, we have lots of social structures, and I take them this is the Metaphysical Society, and so I can actually say this in public here, which I wouldn't do in all groups. I take these social structures as they're entities, they're things, they are metaphysical realities of some sort. We've created them, but they exist. Sometimes I take out a dollar bill. I don't have anything even there, and wave it around, and I ask my students, "What is this?" And first they say $1, and then they think about it and they say it's a piece of paper. And I say, well, but really, what is it that makes this piece of paper something that I could walk into a store, if I could go into a store, and use it to buy? What is it? And there's this enormous social structure that's a kind of reality. And it's a very interesting subject. I'm glad you're working on it, Robert, and I'm sure that there's a lot more to be said about it, and it gets richer and richer over time. One of the reasons that I enjoy working on Hegel is that he's very conscious of the reality of these kinds of structures, and he's interested in their evolution. But so that much I think we agree on. And then the question is, where do you go? You start at the top and work down, as you're suggesting, or do you start at the bottom and work up? So fine. I'm open to all perspectives here. And if we can start at the top and figure out how we could have come to be, that would be great. But I think it's also legitimate to ask about how is it that life could get off the ground, given its origin in matter as it's understood by contemporary philosophy. And if we can't answer that question, maybe what we need to do is to think about, to rethink our understanding of matter, or to rethink our understanding of other metaphysical issues. And I'm sorry, I'm not answering, I'm not providing you with solutions. And
no, it was an unfair question in the light of the time that we have. But I would suggest, if you look at Polanyi's great book, Personal Knowledge, the sections on conviviality, and then go to the last part of his book that deals with the structure of emergence, you have a way of understanding from a very naturalistic point of view, the relationship between social gathering, the forms of articulation and the origins of our specific forms of articulation, and emergent levels, written by a philosopher or originally a physical chemist, but who made his living fundamentally as a philosopher. And I think that there is a way of joining up, going up, and starting up, from the bottom and going up, and starting from the top going down, and finding where they meet. But the issue of sociality and emergence, both in nature and in society, are intimately joined together, it seems to me, even for the metaphysical society, which seems to be somewhat obsessed with I think, starting low and trying to find out how we have managed to get to where we are. But I think we're out of time now because.
Well, can I ask Mel? Mel has had his hand up here. Mel, could you give us a quick question, maybe? And those of you who want to leave, or I don't want to hold anything.
Sure, I can tell you where Dan found the answer, and you might too. Dan showed up at the meeting in Brown of the Society for Philosophy and Psychology. And he was urging everyone, he gave a wonderful talk, as he usually does.
Yeah.
And he was urging everyone to read Terry Deacon's Incomplete Nature. And I should probably have done a paper at that for this meeting. As it happened, I was the only other person in the room who'd worked his way through that volume. But then it also had just reviewed it for, I think, the Yale Journal of Biology. And he said, in effect, okay, I'm finally convinced to give up reductionism. Now, no, so Deacon starts, and the title Incomplete Nature is the vision of nature that you sort of take, is the one that you're contending with. How did you get purpose out of that? And he shows that view of nature is incomplete, but he does it by going all through thermodynamics and information theory. It's a long slog. I will send you an elaborate précis of it that I've done. But it is, I went through it with a group, and I did the précis because they were so impatient with it. It is a dense volume, but it is, I should say, by the way, that to go back to Daniel and to Robert, that the phenomenon of life, where Jonas takes this up, he just says that the first step is an accident, that you get a metabolizing being.
Yes.
I thought your paper was terrific. I think the answer with respect to Dennett, no, it was a wonderful paper because you got this the understanding of teleology that Kant comes to in the third critique already in Plato and Aristotle. That is, that it doesn't have to do with envisioning the end. It has to do with a self-sustaining process that you give. But I think that when Dennett says that function is a structure, he's really redefining structure. Now, I don't know how he does that because I haven't seen, the place. I knew that the book, it was, I don't know, several years after that the book From Bach to, whatever it is, Bach to Biology and back and so on, came out. But, and I don't know how much that reflected what he reported at the time was, a really major change in his point of view. But the Deacon book is a way of tackling it and saying, if you really want to understand the world, you have to go recognize, and he means a genuine incompleteness. He means, a metaphysical incompleteness of nature thus conceived.
As opposed to a conceptual incompleteness.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Well,
So
thank you.
I also, at the beginning, and it may have something to do with this, I missed from your account of Aristotle the definition of the soul as the first actuality of an organized body having life. Now, I think that somehow changes matters when you attribute it to the first actuality, which is comparable to knowledge of a language even while you're dead asleep. All right.
Right. So I didn't give the formal definition because I didn't want to be technical about it. But I did talk about it. The thing is, life is substantial, and it's substantial because it is what defines the thing as what it is. Okay. And you're right. It's the first actuality. It's a potential, but the first actuality is a potential for a particular kind of functioning. And in most animals, it's a very limited. Look, beavers build dams and they do a bunch of other things, and they don't do 10,000 things like May was talking about, and Lao Tzu. As far as I know, they do a couple, and we do 10,000 things or more.
It is, as Gilbert Ryle put it, a disposition.
Yeah, that's it. That's right, disposition.
So. All right, everyone. Thank you to our speakers, and thank you all for sticking around for the conversation. I suppose there'll be room to continue this in the social hour later on tonight.